Tonight, what we are witnessing is as strategically catastrophic as it is operationally decisive. Ukrainian forces have severed the last functioning supply route into Crimea, cutting off approximately 40,000 Russian troops from resupply, reinforcement, and any realistic prospect of evacuation. The Kerch Strait Bridge, already damaged in previous attacks, has now been rendered completely impassable after a coordinated strike that collapsed the remaining functional spans into the water below. The rail ferry system Russia established as backup has been destroyed through precision attacks on port facilities at both Kerch and the Russian mainland terminus. The land corridor through Zaporizhzhia Oblast, which Russia fought for 2 years to maintain, has been cut by Ukrainian ground forces, who now control positions that interdict every road and rail line connecting Crimea to Russian-held territory. 40,000 Russian soldiers, sailors, and airmen are now isolated on a peninsula they cannot leave and cannot be supplied, facing the grim arithmetic of military encirclement. Ammunition depletes, fuel exhausts, food runs out, and Ukrainian forces tighten their grip while Russia lacks the means to prevent slow strangulation. Imagine this: Russian commanders in Sevastopol reviewing logistics reports showing ammunition stocks sufficient for perhaps 2 weeks of sustained defensive operations, fuel reserves that will run dry within a month, food supplies that cannot sustain 40,000 personnel indefinitely without resupply that isn't coming. Picture the panic spreading through Russian formations as soldiers realize their situation, as the Black Sea Fleet sailors understand their ships cannot escape to open water, as the reality sets in that Ukrainian forces have achieved what seemed impossible when they first began targeting Crimean supply infrastructure years ago. Visualize Ukrainian commanders coordinating the systematic reduction of Russian capability across the peninsula, knowing that time now works decisively in their favor, that every day of isolation weakens Russian forces in ways that cannot be reversed. Sounds like descriptions from history books about siege warfare that decided the fate of empires. But tonight, as Ukrainian forces consolidate their positions and Russian supply lines collapse completely, this siege is happening now. What we are witnessing is not gradual degradation or incremental pressure. It is the decisive culmination of a 3-year campaign to isolate Crimea from Russia, the systematic elimination of every supply route through a combination of long-range strikes, naval operations, and ground force advances that have finally achieved complete interdiction. Ukraine has effectively said, "Crimea is cut off, your garrison is trapped, surrender or starve, those are your options now." That's not propaganda or exaggeration. That's the operational reality created by Ukrainian forces who have demonstrated that even the most fortified positions become untenable when supply lines are completely severed. Think about that. Russia has treated Crimea as the crown jewel of its territorial gains since the illegal annexation in 2014, building the Kerch Bridge specifically to establish a permanent supply connection that would make Crimea irreversibly Russian, fortifying the peninsula with air defenses, naval bases, and military infrastructure designed to project power across the Black Sea region. Ukrainian forces have systematically dismantled this entire edifice, destroying the bridge, eliminating the ferry alternatives, severing the land corridor, and trapping a garrison that Russia cannot reinforce or resupply through any available means. Every assumption Russia made about Crimea's security has been proven catastrophically wrong. Here's the first hook. When 40,000 of your soldiers are trapped on a peninsula with no resupply, when every bridge and ferry and land route has been destroyed, when the fortress you built to project power becomes a prison you cannot escape, you haven't just lost a battle. You've lost Crimea not through direct assault, but through the slow strangulation that makes direct assault unnecessary. The garrison will surrender or die, not because Ukrainian forces will overwhelm them, but because ammunition, fuel, and food will simply run out. This is not about one supply route's destruction. It's about the systematic revelation that Ukrainian forces have achieved the capability to isolate any Russian-held territory from resupply, that Russia's military cannot protect logistics infrastructure against Ukrainian precision strikes, that the war's trajectory has shifted decisively toward outcomes that Russian planning never contemplated and cannot prevent. Ukraine has effectively demonstrated that holding territory means nothing when you cannot supply the forces holding it, that fortifications become tombs when supply lines are cut, that military power depends on logistics as much as combat capability. For over a decade since Russia's illegal annexation in 2014, Crimea has occupied unique and absolutely central importance in Russian strategic thinking, national mythology, and Putin's personal conception of his historical legacy. Putin presented the annexation as the correction of a profound historical injustice, the return of traditionally Russian territory that Nikita Khrushchev had arbitrarily transferred to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in 1954 without consulting the Russian people or the Crimean population, the restoration of Russia's natural and eternal position on the Black Sea that Western enemies had sought to deny for centuries through wars, treaties, and diplomatic manipulation. Crimea became central to Putin's narrative of Russian restoration and resurgence, the tangible proof that Russia could reshape borders through force when Russian interests demanded it, that Western objections and condemnations meant nothing against Russian determination, backed by Russian military power, that the post-Cold War settlement, which had supposedly ended Russian influence, could be revised whenever Russia chose to revise it in Russia's favor. The annexation was celebrated in Russia as a national triumph. Putin's approval ratings soared to historic highs, and Crimea became synonymous with the restoration of Russian pride after the humiliations of the 1,990 seconds when Russia had seemed powerless and irrelevant. The strategic importance of Crimea extended far beyond political symbolism and national mythology to concrete military capability that Russia deployed aggressively across the entire Black Sea region and beyond. Sevastopol, home to Russia's Black Sea Fleet, since Catherine the Great established the base in the 18th century, provided the naval facilities from which Russian ships projected power throughout the Mediterranean, supported Russian intervention in Syria, and threatened NATO's southern flank in ways that alliance planners had to account for in every contingency. The port's deep-water harbors could accommodate the largest Russian warships. Its repair facilities could maintain the fleet without dependence on foreign shipyards, and its strategic position at the gateway to the Black Sea made it irreplaceable for Russian naval strategy. Air bases scattered across Crimea hosted bombers capable of striking targets throughout the Middle East and Eastern Europe, fighters that could contest airspace across the Black Sea region, and reconnaissance aircraft that monitored NATO activities throughout southeastern Europe. Missile batteries positioned across the peninsula created air defense networks that extended hundreds of kilometers in every direction, threatening commercial aviation and military aircraft alike, while providing protection for the naval and ground forces stationed on Crimean territory. Crimea was not just territory Russia wanted for symbolic reasons. It was the operational keystone of Russian power projection across an entire strategic region, extending from the eastern Mediterranean to the Caucasus. To secure this strategically vital territory, Russia invested billions in infrastructure designed to make Crimean supply permanent and invulnerable. The Kerch Strait Bridge, completed in 2018 at a cost exceeding $4 billion, created the first fixed connection between Crimea and the Russian mainland, enabling road and rail traffic that reduced dependence on ferry systems vulnerable to weather and capacity constraints. The bridge was both practical infrastructure and political symbol, proof that Russia had permanently integrated Crimea in ways that could never be reversed, that Ukraine's claims to the peninsula were meaningless against Russian concrete and steel. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Crimea served as a crucial staging area for operations along the southern axis, with troops and supplies flowing across the Kerch Bridge to support advances toward Kherson, Mariupol, and beyond. The peninsula's importance increased as the war continued, with the Black Sea Fleet conducting missile strikes against Ukrainian cities and the Crimean logistics network supporting Russian forces across the entire southern front. Severing this logistics network became a Ukrainian strategic priority, not because attacking Crimea directly was feasible, but because isolating Crimea would starve Russian forces across the south of the supplies they needed to sustain operations. Think about that. Ukraine recognized years ago that Crimea was the key to Russian operations in the south, that cutting Crimean supply lines would cascade through Russian logistics across the entire southern theater. Every strike on the Kerch Bridge, every attack on ferry terminals, every operation against the land corridor through Zaporizhia was part of a coordinated campaign whose objective was always the complete isolation now achieved. Ukrainian planners understood their strategy. Russian defenders apparently did not understand how comprehensively they were being targeted until it was too late. For nearly 3 years, Ukrainian forces have conducted a systematic, patient, and extraordinarily sophisticated campaign against Crimean supply infrastructure that has progressively degraded Russian logistics capability, while demonstrating the devastating vulnerability of every supply route Russia established, improved, or attempted to maintain. This campaign, planned from the war's earliest months and executed with increasing precision and effectiveness as Ukrainian capabilities matured, represents one of the most successful strategic interdiction operations in modern military history. The first major strike on the Kerch Strait Bridge occurred in October 2022, when a truck bomb of extraordinary power damaged both road and rail spans in an attack that killed several people, caused fires visible for kilometers, and forced closure of the bridge for repairs that consumed months of effort and enormous resources. This initial attack demonstrated that the bridge Putin built as an indestructible symbol of permanent annexation was neither indestructible nor invulnerable, that Ukrainian forces could reach and damage the most heavily defended infrastructure Russia possessed. Despite the air defense systems, naval patrols, and security measures concentrated around this critical choke point. The psychological impact of that first bridge attack exceeded its immediate material effect. Russians who had been told the bridge guaranteed Crimea's permanent integration discovered that Ukrainian forces could strike at will. Military planners who had built logistics networks around assumed bridge availability discovered those assumptions were dangerously wrong. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded the bridge, the engineering marvel that supposedly demonstrated Russian capability, was shattered by an attack Russia had believed impossible. Subsequent attacks on the bridge inflicted additional and progressively more severe damage through different methods that demonstrated Ukrainian ability to adapt and overcome Russian defensive improvements. Naval drone strikes targeted support structures beneath the roadway, exploiting vulnerabilities that Russian engineers struggled to protect. Missile attacks struck roadway sections with precision that collapsed spans into the strait. Special operations that Ukrainian forces have never fully detailed exploited security vulnerabilities that Russian defenders proved unable to close despite enormous investment in protective measures. Each attack forced repairs that consumed resources and time while demonstrating that Russian defenses would never be adequate to guarantee the bridge's security. Think about that. Ukraine attacked the Kerch Bridge repeatedly over 3 years, each attack demonstrating different capabilities, each attack forcing Russian defensive adaptations that proved inadequate against the next attack's methods. The bridge that was supposed to guarantee Crimean supply became instead a demonstration of Ukrainian capability to destroy whatever Russia built, regardless of defensive investment. While attacking the bridge, Ukrainian forces simultaneously targeted the alternative supply routes Russia attempted to establish. Ferry terminals at Kerch and on the Russian mainland were struck with precision weapons that destroyed loading equipment, damaged port facilities, and sank vessels attempting to maintain supply flow while the bridge was under repair. Russian attempts to establish new ferry routes were met with attacks on the new terminals before they could become operational. Every alternative Russia developed, Ukraine destroyed, creating a pattern of systematic interdiction that left Russian planners with no viable options. The land corridor through Zaporizhzhia Oblast represented Russia's third supply option, a route that bypassed both bridge and ferries by connecting Crimea to Russian-held territory in eastern Ukraine. Russia fought desperately throughout 2022 and 2023 to maintain this corridor, recognizing that its severance would leave Crimea dangerously dependent on vulnerable maritime connections. Ukrainian forces, equally aware of the corridor's importance, conducted operations designed to cut it first through long-range strikes on bridges, rail lines, and logistics nodes along the route, then through ground operations that progressively narrowed the corridor until the final breakthrough achieved this week severed it completely. Let's be honest about the magnitude of what Ukraine has accomplished. They have isolated a peninsula that Russia has fortified and defended more heavily than any other territory, that Russia considered so strategically vital that losing it was unthinkable, that Russia built a $4 billion bridge specifically to ensure permanent supply. Ukrainian forces accomplished this isolation not through any single dramatic operation, but through years of patient, systematic degradation that eliminated every supply option Russia possessed. The comprehensive nature of this achievement reflects strategic planning and operational execution that military professionals will study for decades. And yet, Russian commanders in Crimea apparently failed to fully prepare for the isolation that is now their reality, despite years of warning that Ukrainian forces were systematically destroying their supply options. Stockpiles that should have been built during periods when supply routes remained open were not accumulated in sufficient quantities. Defensive preparations that should have anticipated potential isolation were not adequately developed. Evacuation plans that should have been ready for implementation were apparently never created. Russian forces are now trapped in a situation their commanders should have anticipated and prepared for, but evidently did not. Here's the second hook. You can fortify a peninsula, deploy air defenses, station a fleet, create the most heavily defended position in your entire military, but you cannot hold any position indefinitely without supply. Ammunition runs out, fuel depletes, food exhausts. The most powerful garrison becomes helpless when logistics are cut. Russia built Crimea into a fortress and forgot that fortresses without supply lines become tombs. That's not military strategy, it's slow suffocation that no amount of combat power can prevent. Intelligence reports indicate conditions across Russian-held Crimea are deteriorating rapidly and catastrophically as the full reality of complete isolation takes hold among both military commanders and civilian administrators who must now plan for circumstances they apparently never seriously prepared to face. Military units throughout the peninsula have implemented strict rationing protocols for ammunition, with orders from Crimean headquarters restricting expenditure to only the most absolutely necessary defensive fires and prohibiting training, harassment, fire, or any other ammunition use that isn't directly required for immediate tactical situations. Artillery batteries that have been firing at Ukrainian positions for months now count their remaining shells and calculate how many days they can sustain even minimal defensive capability. Fuel distribution has been centralized under direct headquarters control, with priority given to essential military operations while all non-critical vehicle use has been suspended indefinitely. The civilian transportation that kept Crimean economy functioning, trucks delivering goods, buses moving people, private vehicles providing mobility, has been restricted as military requirements consume available fuel stocks. Aircraft that once flew patrol and strike missions now sit on runways conserving fuel for contingencies their commanders hope will never arrive. Naval vessels remain at anchor rather than conducting operations that would consume irreplaceable fuel. Food supplies across the peninsula, while currently adequate for immediate needs, are being inventoried and rationed with the grim recognition that no replenishment is coming through any channel. Military food distribution has been calculated against personnel requirements, producing timelines that every officer understands represent hard limits beyond which their forces will no longer be combat effective, regardless of their weapons or training. The civilian population of Crimea, approximately 2 million people, whose supply also depended on the now severed routes, faces its own emerging humanitarian crisis, as store shelves begin emptying and the supply chains that kept them stocked have ceased functioning entirely. The psychological impact on trapped Russian forces is devastating and intensifying with each passing day, as the hopelessness of their situation becomes undeniable to soldiers, sailors, and commanders alike. Intercepted communications reveal growing panic among units. Recognizing their predicament, officers attempting to maintain discipline while privately acknowledging in conversations with colleagues and family that no relief is coming, and enlisted soldiers discussing surrender as a preferable alternative to starvation or death in combat. They cannot win against Ukrainian forces who now hold every advantage time can provide. The communications paint a picture of forces whose morale is collapsing as rapidly as their supply situation. Forces whose officers struggle to provide hope they themselves do not possess. The Black Sea Fleet, pride of Russian naval power in the region for over 2 centuries, finds itself trapped in Sevastopol harbor in what may be the most humiliating position any major naval force has experienced since the Imperial Russian fleet was destroyed at Tsushima in 1905. The fleet cannot escape to open water. Ukrainian control of the strait approaches and Ukrainian anti-ship capabilities throughout the western Black Sea make any attempt at breakout essentially suicidal. The ships that remain operational lack the fuel reserves for extended operations, even if they could somehow evade Ukrainian targeting. Ammunition stores for the missiles that made these vessels strategically relevant are depleting without prospect of replenishment. The fleet has essentially become a collection of floating targets whose crews understand with devastating clarity that they cannot escape, cannot fight effectively, and cannot be resupplied with the weapons, fuel, and provisions their operations require. Sailors who joined the Navy expecting to project Russian power across the Mediterranean now contemplate the possibility of surrendering ships whose names carry centuries of Russian naval tradition. The psychological weight of this situation, serving aboard vessels that have become traps rather than weapons, is evident in communications that reveal crews whose pride has given way to despair and whose confidence has given way to fear of what isolation will eventually require them to do. What makes this isolation even more strategically significant is the complete and devastating absence of Russian options for relieving the trapped garrison through any means currently available or likely to become available on relevant timescales. Reopening the Kerch Strait Bridge would require months of intensive reconstruction work conducted under continuous Ukrainian attack from multiple vectors, missiles, drones, naval systems, and potentially special operations that could strike workers and equipment at any point during the repair process. Such reconstruction work simply cannot succeed when Ukrainian forces have demonstrated they can strike bridge infrastructure at will, and when every construction barge, crane, and work crew becomes an immediate target the moment it approaches the damaged spans. Establishing new ferry routes to bypass the destroyed bridge faces the identical fundamental problem. Any port facility Russia attempts to use for ferry operations becomes an immediate Ukrainian target whose destruction has been demonstrated repeatedly throughout the war. Russia attempted to establish ferry backup operations at multiple points along the Kerch Strait coastline, and Ukrainian forces destroyed each attempt before it could become operationally significant. The pattern is clear and apparently unbreakable. Russian maritime logistics infrastructure cannot survive against Ukrainian precision strike capability, regardless of where Russia attempts to establish it. Retaking the land corridor through Zaporizhia Oblast would require ground offensive operations that Russian forces have proven comprehensively incapable of executing successfully against Ukrainian defensive positions that have been prepared and strengthened over months of anticipation. The forces that would be required for such an offensive don't exist in relevant positions. The logistics that would support such an offensive have themselves been degraded by Ukrainian interdiction. The command competence that would be required to plan and execute such an offensive has been conspicuously absent from Russian military performance throughout the war. The land corridor option is theoretical, not practical. Air supply to Crimea cannot remotely approach the scale required to sustain 40,000 military personnel plus 2 million civilians. The largest aircraft in Russian inventory can deliver approximately 100 tons per sortie, and Crimea would require thousands of tons daily to maintain minimal functionality. The mathematics are impossible, and Ukrainian air defenses would destroy significant percentages of any aircraft attempting the supply mission regardless. Think about that. Russian commanders have examined every option for relieving the Crimean garrison and found that no option exists. The bridge cannot be repaired under fire. The ferries cannot operate through Ukrainian interdiction. The land corridor cannot be reopened through offensive operations. Russia cannot execute. Air supply is mathematically inadequate. Every avenue has been closed through Ukrainian operations that anticipated and prevented every Russian alternative. The garrison is trapped with no prospect of relief. The haunting irony of Crimea's isolation lies in how precisely it mirrors the siege warfare Russia has employed against Ukrainian cities throughout the war. Russian forces besieged Mariupol, attempting to starve out defenders through supply interdiction. Russian forces have targeted Ukrainian infrastructure precisely to create the kind of humanitarian suffering now emerging in Crimea. The strategy Russia employed against Ukraine is now being employed against Russia, and Russian forces are discovering that siege warfare is considerably less appealing when you're the one being besieged. Here's the third hook. When the siege tactics you've used against others are turned against your own forces. When the supply interdiction strategy you employed to break enemy cities breaks your own garrison instead. When you discover that isolation and starvation are as effective against your troops as you hoped they would be against your enemies, you experience the moral weight of your own methods applied to your own people. Russia is experiencing that weight in Crimea tonight. The symbolism of Crimea's isolation carries extraordinary significance that extends far beyond immediate military implications to fundamental questions about the war's trajectory and eventual outcome. Crimea was Putin's great triumph, the annexation that restored Russian glory, the territory whose seizure supposedly demonstrated that Russia could reshape borders through force and face no meaningful consequences. The peninsula's isolation represents the systematic reversal of everything that annexation was supposed to prove. Ukraine can contest Russian territorial claims, can impose devastating consequences for aggression, can trap and destroy the forces Russia deployed to hold stolen territory. Consider what Crimea's isolation symbolizes for the broader narrative of this war. Russia invaded Ukraine, claiming military superiority that would achieve quick victory, that Russian forces would easily overwhelm Ukrainian resistance, that the West would accept Russian gains rather than risk confrontation. 3 years later, Ukrainian forces have trapped 40,000 Russian soldiers on a peninsula. Russia considered permanently secured demonstrated that Russian military power cannot protect even Russia's most valued territorial acquisitions and created conditions where surrender or starvation are Russia's only remaining options for its Crimean garrison. What makes this symbolism even more powerful is the connection to Russian national mythology about Crimea specifically. Sevastopol was the site of legendary Russian resistance during the Crimean War of the 1,850 seconds, where Russian defenders held against British, French, and Ottoman siege for nearly a year before finally succumbing. Soviet forces defended Sevastopol again during World War II, enduring German siege before eventual defeat. Russian mythology presents Crimean defense as the ultimate expression of Russian military virtue, determined resistance against overwhelming odds, sacrifice for the motherland, glory even in defeat. Now, Russian forces in Crimea face siege again, but this time the besiegers are Ukrainians fighting to recover their own territory, and Russian surrender will carry none of the heroic mythology that cloaked previous Crimean defeats. Think about that. The peninsula Russia seized to restore national glory has become the site of national humiliation. The fortress Russia built to project power has become a trap. Russia cannot escape. The mythology of Crimean resistance that Russians have celebrated for generations will now include a chapter where Russian forces surrendered to Ukrainians they had invaded and occupied. The symbolic inversion is complete and devastating. The human dimension of Crimea's isolation encompasses both military personnel facing supply exhaustion and civilian population sharing their predicament. Approximately 2 million civilians live in Crimea, people whose daily needs for food, medicine, fuel, and other essentials were supplied through the same routes, now severed. These civilians include ethnic Russians who supported annexation, Ukrainians who opposed it, and Crimean Tatars who faced persecution under Russian occupation. All of them now face supply disruptions, whose severity will increase as isolation continues, creating humanitarian crisis that adds moral weight to the strategic situation. Russian authorities face impossible choices regarding Crimea's civilian population. Evacuating 2 million people by air is logistically impossible and would constitute admission that Crimea cannot be held. Maintaining civilian supply through methods that can't supply the military would divert resources from forces already facing shortage. Prioritizing military supply while civilians suffer creates conditions where the population Russia claimed to be protecting from Ukrainian aggression suffers precisely because of Russian decisions. Every option reveals the bankruptcy of Russian policy and the consequences of Putin's annexation. Here's the fourth hook. When your strategic decisions trap not just soldiers but 2 million civilians in conditions of siege, when the population you claim to be protecting faces starvation because of your choices, when the glory you sought to restore becomes suffering you cannot prevent, you've demonstrated something profound about the nature of your rule. It was never about protecting people. It was about projecting power. And now that power projection has failed, the people you claim to protect pay the price. For Russian military planners, who have relied on Crimean infrastructure to support operations throughout the southern theater, the peninsula's isolation creates cascading operational challenges that extend far beyond the trapped garrison itself. Forces in occupied southern Ukraine that depended on Crimean logistics must now be supplied through alternative routes that cannot carry equivalent volume. Air operations from Crimean bases that struck targets across Ukraine must now relocate to bases with less favorable positioning. Naval operations that projected power across the Black Sea must now operate without the Sevastopol facilities that supported them. The loss of Crimea as a logistics hub degrades Russian capability across the entire southern front. The psychological impact extends throughout Russian military and political leadership, who must now contemplate the loss of territory Putin declared would never be surrendered, whose retention was supposedly guaranteed by military power that has proven inadequate. Commanders who assured Putin that Crimea was secure must explain how security collapsed completely. Political figures who built careers on Crimean annexation must face the consequences of that annexation's failure. The entire Russian leadership structure confronts a defeat that cannot be explained away, cannot be hidden from Russian citizens who will eventually learn what has happened, cannot be reversed through any means currently available. Image matters enormously in sustaining authoritarian rule, and images emerging from Crimea communicate Russian failure more effectively than any Ukrainian statement could accomplish. Satellite imagery shows the destroyed bridge spans, the burning ferry terminals, the severed land corridor. Intercepted communications reveal the desperation of trapped forces recognizing their situation. Videos from Crimean residents show empty store shelves and growing fear as the reality of isolation becomes apparent. The images accumulate into an undeniable picture of strategic catastrophe that Russian propaganda cannot obscure. Something deeper than military operation is unfolding in Crimea tonight. Something that cannot be measured in supply routes severed or troops trapped. It's a fundamental shift in understanding of what this war means. of who is winning and who is losing, of whether Russia can hold the territory it has claimed against Ukrainian determination to recover it. Crimea was supposed to be proof that Russian power could reshape reality permanently. Crimea's isolation is proof that reality eventually reshapes Russian delusions. Western responses to Crimea's isolation have been carefully calibrated, but clearly and unambiguously supportive of Ukrainian achievement in cutting off the peninsula that Russia illegally seized. NATO officials have emphasized repeatedly that Crimea is Ukrainian territory under international law, and that all Ukrainian operations to recover it constitute legitimate self-defense, regardless of Russian claims to sovereignty that no Western nation recognizes. Intelligence sharing arrangements that contributed to Ukrainian targeting of supply infrastructure continue through established channels that neither government discusses publicly, but whose effectiveness is evident in the precision and timing of Ukrainian strikes throughout the three-year campaign. Diplomatic statements from Washington, London, Berlin, and other allied capitals emphasize that any resolution of this war must include restoration of Ukrainian territorial integrity, including Crimea. Statements that gain substantial credibility from Ukrainian military success in isolating the K4 Peninsula and demonstrating that recovery is operationally feasible rather than merely diplomatically desirable. The Western consensus has hardened around the position that Crimea's illegal annexation cannot be accepted as permanent, and Ukrainian forces are providing the military basis for diplomatic positions that seemed aspirational just months ago. So tonight, as 40,000 Russian troops face isolation on a peninsula their country claimed would be Russian forever, and as Russian commanders confront the reality that no relief is possible, remember this carefully. We're witnessing the decisive demonstration that Ukrainian forces can isolate and starve any Russian-held territory, regardless of how heavily Russia has fortified it, that Russian supply lines are comprehensively vulnerable to Ukrainian interdiction, that the war's trajectory has shifted toward Ukrainian recovery of territory Russia claimed was permanently lost. Power is being redefined from territory held to territory supplied. Russia holds Crimea on paper, but Russia cannot supply the forces holding it, cannot sustain the civilians living there, cannot prevent the slow collapse that isolation inevitably produces. Holding becomes meaningless when supply becomes impossible. When historians examine this war, Crimea's isolation will occupy decisive place as the moment when Ukrainian victory became inevitable, when Russian defeat became undeniable, when the territory Putin seized to restore Russian glory became the graveyard of Russian pretensions to great power status. You cannot hold territory without supply. You cannot supply what you cannot reach, and you cannot maintain the mythology of victory when 40,000 of your soldiers are trapped awaiting surrender on a peninsula you said would be Russian forever. Crimea is isolated. The garrison is trapped. And Ukrainian forces have demonstrated that patience, precision, and systematic pressure can achieve what direct assault might have cost far more to accomplish. Freedom reclaims what tyranny stole through the patient strategy of isolation that makes occupation unsustainable. That's where we leave it tonight. 40,000 troops trapped, supply lines severed, and Crimea transformed from Russian trophy to Russian catastrophe. I'm Maddow. Thank you for being here. Stay informed, and good night.